Okay, let's start on our list of invasive plants. So we'll start with woody invasive plants. Autumn olive. This is a big one. It's been a big one at the clearing. I think maybe Ellison Bay is autumn olive central in Door County. There is a lot of it around here. Well, this is an Asian shrub. It's in the same genus as Russian olive, but Russian olive is more of a small-scale tree. This is more of a large shrub. It's often multiple-stemmed, can get 12, 15 feet tall. It has leaves that are hairless. They're real glossy, green on top, pretty. The bottom side, they're silvery, and again, there's no hair in them at all. This is important. And they're alternate. The leaves are alternate on the stem. They're not opposite each other. They're alternate each other. And the stems are this nice kind of chocolate brown. They produce a very fragrant small yellow flower in spring. When I first came here, the first year or two, I would remember asking people, what smell? It was like May. What smells so good? It was autumn olive. Once I learned that, then I didn't like the smell quite as much. So they flower in spring, and then over the summer and into fall, they produce a pretty little red berry about the size of a small pea with these specks on it. And it's the only fruit that I know that has those speckles on it up here. So that's an easy way to identify it. And the birds just love them. They'll eat every single one off any given plant that's fruiting, and they'll, of course, you know what they do then. They move it all around. So, and this is one, if you catch it when it's little, and even a 1 or 2 year plant, once you learn, you know, part of this is just seeing something often enough that you just know it on sight from 20 feet away. It's pretty easy to spot even as a small plant, where you can probably still pull it. Or if it's a little bit bigger, you can probably dig it. But remember, when you pull or dig something, you're disturbing the soil and making a little garden for other stuff to want to come in. So that's not always the best, but that's what a lot of people do. Once it gets bigger, and the stems can get, we cut some across the street that we counted the rings. They were 40-some years old, and they were in that neighborhood, 5 inches across. They were monsters. The ones we have on the property here, anything more than about 1 inch was a pretty big one, but there were some big ones over across the street. So what you do is you simply cut them down low and treat them with something like this. If you don't want to use something like that on something like that, you can just cut it. You know it's going to resprout, and just keep going back again and again and again for several years sometimes until you starve it out. You can do that. It just takes a lot more effort and time. So this is one where you would want to treat the cut surface with glyphosate safely and prevent most of the resprouting. This is one that we did it, well, all these invasive species came because of human activity one way or another. This is one where we really blew it. This was promoted by state DNRs and soil conservation services back in the 40s and 50s as a wildlife plant. Birds love it. They do love it. Why we weren't promoting our native shrubs, dogwoods and things like that, I have no idea. It's a mystery why we had to bring this kind of, Multiflora rose is another one. And buckthorn, by the way. And we brought these in as wildlife plants, as good conservation plants, and created a nightmare. They would have come in anyway because it was in the nursery trade as an ornamental. But we really got, a lot more of them got planted because they were sold as cheap little seedlings from the Soil Conservation Service primarily, I think. This is the one that it sometimes is confused with. This is Russet buffaloberry, a native shrub, a nice native shrub that has opposite leaves, not alternate, but they're opposite on the stem. They're hairy, kind of scurfy, and the underside has these kind of brownish orange spots. That's the russeting, like a russet apple. So they're much different foliage than autumn olive. Similar fruits, doesn't have the speckles on them like autumn olive. This is, I think, the first native plant up here to produce mature fruit. It's usually mature by late June, and the birds take it right away. Autumn olive isn't even red yet by late June, so you can do it by the timing, the color of the fruit too. This is done by midsummer, and autumn olive doesn't ripen until probably September. But this is one, for some reason, that people have a hard time telling apart, telling this from autumn olive. And this is really a nice native shrub. Not something you'd want probably in your garden. It's kind of rangy and kind of falls down on the edges, and it's not really a neat looking plant. But it's great for wildlife. It's the first thing birds find to eat if they want berries up here. It doesn't get real big. It's a very nice plant, a common along the edges of woods and out in meadow. So again, easy for some reason to misidentify. Black locust, this is one that I think with winters getting warmer, we're going to probably see more and more black locust up here. The bark looks a little bit like a red oak. Beautiful pea-like, it's a legume, so pea-like flowers in spring, very fragrant. They produce the pods, have a good sized seed in there, and those fall to the ground, are eaten by animals and birds, and get spread around that way. It has a compound leaf, like an ash tree. This is called pinnately compound, where you have a central rachis, it's called, with leaflets growing on either side of the rachis. So this whole thing right here is one leaf. The bud is at the base of the rachis. Definition of a leaf is it has to have a bud in the axil where the leaf joins the stem. There has to be a bud in the axil. Little thorny too, yeah. Not like a honey locust or a hawthorn, but enough to get your attention. Yeah. It's native further south in the United States, Missouri, southern Illinois, Kentucky down in there. It was brought up as an ornamental, and it was also brought up before barbed wire came along. It's one of those plants, because of the thorns, that you could plant in a hedgerow and it had thorns contain the livestock. So it was one of those used as a fence before barbed wire came along. This is a big one, common buckthorn, and I am so grateful that we don't have it on this property yet. I'm just waiting because it's moved around by birds. And we have some parts of the property where we don't get to very often, off trail. And again, I'm waiting for the day where I spot one. They're pretty easy to spot if you know them. But this is one that can get started on you and you don't even know it's there for 10 years. It's considered sub-opposite. The leaves are opposite, but not quite. They're a little bit off. Only plant I know that is like that. Real glossy with veins, a lot like a dogwood leaf. It looks a little bit like a dogwood leaf with these parallel veins without any side veins. The bark looks like a cherry tree. Very attractive bark, cherry-like bark. Kind of nondescript flowers, yellowish green in spring. Most people don't notice them. And they end up developing into these black berries in fall that birds love. Small scale tree, often multiple stemmed. A 30-foot tall one is a pretty good size one, and the biggest ones I've seen on my brother Phil's property in Elkhorn are like, they're just monsters. You see one, one like that is a pretty big one up here. He has them like this. He uses it for firewood. He burns it as firewood. So this is a biggie. People are surprised that this is on the list. I've lived on my property for, 12 years now, and I've got just little ones that are in enough shade that either they're too young to flower yet or they're in enough shade that they're not going to flower, but You know, I'm dealing with these. I've probably taken 40 or 50 off my property, all little ones. But across NP from where I live, there's an open field that used to be a cherry orchard years ago. And now it's got the juniper in it and some Scots pine and some white pine and some red pine and a lot of lilacs. And now they're flowering and fruiting. I keep thinking I should put on my camouflage outfit and some night go across. It'd be a lot of work though. There's so many of them. So I think you're going to see, and I've seen other places up here where there's a lot of lilac. And again, is it pretty? Does it smell good? Yep. Do we all love lilac? Yep. It's a non-native that has naturalized, so it's kind of gone wild. It's proliferated to the point where it is impacting native plants in undisturbed areas. So anyway, but again, I wanted a lilac in my garden, knowing that it could be invasive. So I simply, when the flowers are done, I go in and cut it off. The plant's only that tall now. At some point in time, it's going to be taller than that, and I'm going to have to get on a step ladder. It'll be a little more work, but I'm willing to do it because I wanted a lilac, but I didn't want to cause a problem either. Here's another one that people say, how can that possibly be an invasive? I wouldn't call this a serious one. Maybe in time it will be. European cranberry bush viburnum. We have a native one too, the American cranberry bush viburnum. This is the American one here with those leaves. This is a European species, a slightly different leaf shape. So this is a good guy, often seen in wetter soils. This is one that was planted as an ornamental for 100 years or more. There are different cultivars or varieties too. Some are dwarfer, some have yellow foliage. But they all produce this, I call it a doily-like flower, with the fertile flowers in the middle and the sterile outer flowers on the outside. Nature does this to make it more showy, so bees notice it more and come in. Actually, this is, I think, pollinated more by flies than by bees. But very ornamental, great flowers. Fruit lasts right through winter, usually on high bush cranberries. And there's a reason for that. Birds aren't dumb. Birds know which food is most nutritious. So they'll take the dogwoods and the viburnums and some of the crab apples in fall. They know which are the best fruits to get them through winter. And then as they get desperate in later winter and early spring, they start feeding on things that aren't as nutritious. In the meantime, the juice inside these has fermented and made wine. And I remember seeing a couple times in my life robins stumbling around on the ground like they were drunk. Well, they were drunk from eating something like that. Another buckthorn that I haven't seen a lot in the wild, apparently it's a big problem further south in the county in some wetland areas, glossy buckthorn, first cousin to common buckthorn, similar cherry-like bark. Leaves are a little different, opposite. This one the fruit goes through a change where you have some red ones on for a while. They all eventually turn to black. On common buckthorn, they go green, and then I don't think they ever turn red. I think they go to black. So ornamental fruit, similar flowers to its cousin, little kind of light yellow, nondescript flowers, and it likes wet soil. It's a small-scale tree, often a little narrower than common buckthorn. Common buckthorn often looks like an old apple tree. It spreads out quite a bit in the open, anyway. There are two cultivars or varieties that are still in the market. The common one is called tall hedge, or tall hedge glossy buckthorn. It's a commonly used hedging plant because it grows like a column. And it can get quite tall, 8-10 feet tall. That's still sold. And there's one that's really quite nice. It's called the fern leaf glossy buckthorn with cut leaves that are very fine and makes a nice garden accent. So they're still sold, but they're a serious invasive in wet areas in particular, one to avoid. Japanese barberry. This is one that finally the state of Wisconsin has outlawed. We might be in the last year of the grace period that nurseries were given to sell out of their stock. And they just can't grow this anymore now. I've seen it like this. There's an area on, I think that's Lagerquist Road as you're going south at 57 just past Meridian Park. That first road that goes off to the right. I think Waseda Farms is down there. If you look especially on the south side of the road, unless they've done something about it, it's just solid in places. This was, of course, a common ornamental for a long time. There were many cultivars, some with maroon-colored leaves, some dwarfer, kind of a mound-shaped, trailing plant. Doesn't get much taller than maybe 3-4 feet usually, the straight species. Small spoon-shaped leaves in little clusters, little bunches along the stem, alternate along the stem, those bunches. And it produces these kind of egg-shaped bright red fruits later in the season that, of course, the birds are going to eat eventually and move around. Thorns, not fun to work with. So this is one that is now illegal in the state of Wisconsin. Nice little yellow flowers. It's a pretty little plant. It's hard to work with because it's thorny. This is a new one that I found at the clearing down on our beach, I don't know, 10, 12 years ago. And I said, well, I knew it was a prunus. I knew it was a plum or a cherry or something. It's in the genus Prunus. But I just couldn't recognize it. I knew it wasn't a choke cherry or wild black cherry or American plum. And so I finally did a little research on it and figured out it was a Mahaleb cherry, which I think, if I remember correctly, was brought in either as rootstock for grafted cherries somewhere in the country, or maybe as a pollinator. That a lot of times in apple orchards, they'll plant every 10th one will be a dogo crab apple because it's a good pollinator for apple trees. So I'm not sure if this was a pollinator or a rootstock, one of the two. And it kind of got away. I've only seen it along our shoreline, a few of them where we've taken them down. But it's one of those up-and-comers maybe. And because it has these, you know what's going to happen to those. I mean, birds love, above all other fruits, they love dogwood fruits and prunus fruits. So they're all going to get eaten by a bird and moved around. Thankfully, we don't have this up here. The only ones I've seen in all of Door County, Multiflora rose, which is a beast, by the way, was at Peninsula State Park. I was up on the tower once with my kids and my wife, and I looked down over the edge and said, I think there's a Multiflora rose down there. So I got down and went, and sure enough, there were a couple of them down there. I didn't expect to see those there. And I remember I called the park like later that week and told them, you might want to get on those because you don't want those to get away from you. And again, as we get warmer up here, this is one that might slowly creep up further north. And if you think dealing with Japanese barberry is bad, you will beg for that after dealing with these, because these things are just absolutely wicked. And I used to live in Kenosha County before I came up here, and I was out in areas in the wild in western Kenosha County where just solid fields of this, and you got into a place and you just didn't know how you even got in there, and now how do I get out of here? Because they just grab you everywhere and rip your clothing. People that deal with these, they'll have to make a tunnel for themselves to even get into the base safely where they can start cutting. It's just horrible working with these, and I've done it. So not a problem up here yet that I know of, but it might be coming. It has, like all roses, pinnately compound leaves, like I showed you on the black locust. Like all plants in the rose family, so roses, plums, cherries, peaches, apples, crab apples, spirea, potentilla, all those plants are in one big family. They have perfect flowers, 5 petals, and both sexes in the same flower, synoecious or perfect. Most plants with perfect flowers cannot pollinate themselves. Some can. Tart cherries can pollinate themselves. They're called self-fertile. But most plants with perfect flowers are self-infertile. They have to have pollen from another Multiflora rose in this case. But this is one that we do not want up here. Another one that was promoted by the Soil Conservation Service for decades as a wildlife plant. We have a bittersweet that's invasive, the Oriental bittersweet, which is the one on top here, with more rounded leaves, and it has the fruit clusters all along the stem. As opposed to our native bittersweet with more elongated leaf with a point on them and terminal clusters of berries. Still, not the easiest to tell apart unless you look at it a lot. We had quite a few of these at the clearing in one spot that we got rid of about, 4 or 5 years ago, and I think we have a pretty good handle on them now. But again, it's a berry producing plant, and birds are going to eat these and move it around that way. So these are the most troublesome ones in many ways, the ones that birds will eat, because they can travel a long distance. Scots pine, or as most people know, it's Scotch pine. I learned it as Scots pine, so that's why I hang on to that. This is a pretty serious invasive evergreen tree up here. You see some old ones on farm land that are just gorgeous specimen trees. Old cemeteries often have Scots pine in them. Commonly grown as a Christmas tree. It shears well, grows fast. It's a true pine. Some people call everything that's evergreen in a tree a pine tree. Well, there are pines and there are spruce and firs and hemlocks and Douglas fir and arborvitae and on and on and on and on. The true pines have needles in bundles. And on Scots pine, they're in a bundle of 2. If you pull it off, they're always in 2s. White pine is always in bundles of 5. It's one of the 5 needle pines. And red pines, another native pine up here, are always in bundles of 2 also. And needles are fairly short on Scots pine for a pine. They're maybe around 2 inches long. They're blue-green in color, and they twist like a barber pole. The needles are a little twisted, so easy to identify. Produces gorgeous orangey bark later in life. They really do end up becoming marvelous specimens. But they seed everywhere, and they like open ground and sunny areas, and you can't drive too far in Door County and not see some of them where they really shouldn't be. I know that's a matter of opinion. And again, with the shading, the ultimate long-term shading of much of Door County, we'll probably see fewer of these because they don't tolerate shade. But in the interim, there are a lot of them. The shrubby honeysuckles. The one that I see the most often is one called Tatarian honeysuckle. There are some other hybrids. They have these pretty, usually pink. Sometimes they're more toward white, but most of them are pink flowers that hummingbirds and pollinating insects love because there's all that sweet nectar in that flower. They produce eventually a bright red kind of almost translucent fruit, size of a small pea. Almost always red, and some you'll see it's orange, but usually red. Multiple stem shrub, almost always can get 6, 8, 10 feet tall. They'll often kind of flop down after a while and lay down, kind of a rangy thing. The bark is kind of shreddy after a while. And of course the birds just are crazy about these. Move them all around. It was a common landscape plant for ever. Common landscape ground cover called Periwinkle and Myrtle. Nice glossy green opposite leaves. They're so glossy that if you want to kill them, like we do at the clearing in a couple places, and spray them with glyphosate, it just rolls right off. Timing is really crucial. You got to get them before they form that waxy coating. Now this isn't going to, seed's not going to blow over there. It doesn't have a fruit that birds eat and plant over there. It's just a patch that's this big. In time will be as big as this room. It just grows out over time and tolerates shade very well. So it'll grow in the densest shade. Here's another one that we see every now and then. This was a common landscape plant years ago. It fell out of favor because it gets so huge. One of the viburnums, Wayfaringtree viburnum, can get 15 feet tall and 20 feet wide. It's a gigantic plant. Very ornamental, like all viburnums, a nice cluster of white flowers, and they eventually turn into these black berries, but in the process you have got green and red and black in the same cluster. A kind of quilted foliage, very nice leaves that turn, like on all viburnums, a nice maroon in the fall. So very nice ornamental features. I see this every now and then as I'm walking around in the wild places up here. And other people that deal with invasives have reported seeing it too. Not a serious problem now. It's a plant you probably don't even know, and you may never see it. But again, over time, with warming winters, you might see this more.